Time. Thanks, Ruby. We are recording, thank you. And Brittany sent the slides, syllabus, and information about the secret word and attendance. If you have any questions on those items, please let us know. And Brittany, can you just wave and reintroduce yourself today for students who may be joining for the first time?
Yeah, hi, I'm Brittany Hun. I am a rising sophomore at UCLA. I am on the student assistant for the Summer Academy, and I'm here to answer any of your questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Brittany. So Brittany is also helping monitor the chat, and some of you asked questions in the chat last time that we weren't able to get to in the course of the talk. And Brittany then sent me your questions, and I was able to respond after the fact via email. So if you have questions today and we're not able to get to your questions, we will respond. Please feel free to put them in the chat and we will respond after the fact. And if you did ask something on Tuesday and you felt like I missed it or didn't get back to you, again, feel free to put it in there again today or reach out directly and we'll be happy to respond. As a reminder, the office hours are on Monday from 3 to 4. And I've gotten a couple emails. Students, I think some of you are planning to attend. Please join us. We'd love to see you. Not required, but just an option if you want to come and check in or ask questions. We're happy to talk further. The Zoom link for the office hours is on the syllabus. And finally, I received some questions from students, essentially asking, like, do we really need foster care? And I think that probably gets at some of the issues that we talked about relating to disproportionality and the overrepresentation of certain populations of children in care, as well as some of the issues relating to poverty that, really give rise to the number of kids in care. And so I really want to emphasize and be clear that child abuse and neglect is a very serious and in some cases criminal matter in LA County, in California, and in our country. So again, to emphasize, child abuse and neglect is a very serious issue that in some cases certainly gives rise to the need for foster care. So yes, we need foster care or some version of an alternative for kids who are truly unsafe at home. And yet that system needs very significant improvement. And there are also many kids who get caught up in the system because of poverty, systemic racism, and many, many, many other social ills that our world is facing. So we also need widespread support and training that helps families prevent child abuse and neglect. We need support so parents have the skills that they need to parent, as well as overall enhancements to our schools and communities to make them safer and more effective places where all children can thrive. We also need widespread solutions to a range of social issues such as mass incarceration, homelessness, immigration, limited health access, mental health services, support for families with disabilities, on and on. So this is a both and situation where we need prevention and we need intervention. And that's why you'll hear us talk about that so much at the UCLA Pritzker Center, and why you'll see that balance hopefully reflected in our Summer Academy. So I just wanted to close the loop on that for any of you who might have left being like, well, I don't really know if we need this foster care system, because sadly, child abuse and neglect is a real issue that for many kids, foster care can be a safe place for them that we need to therefore improve and make better. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Audra Langley. Dr. Langley is a professor at the UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Behavior and the co-director of the UCLA Pritzker Center. Dr. Langley will be talking about mental health and well-being for children and families today, with a specific emphasis on children in foster care. Dr. Langley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Taylor. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to spend the next couple of hours together. Volume okay? We good on audio? Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. I was able to join on Tuesday when Taylor shared time with you all. And I do want to say that today will be a little more lecture style in that I've been asked to talk about a range of topics related to adversity, trauma, and resilience. And I want to make sure that I get some of that information imparted and try to be as interactive as we can in our virtual setting. So let me go ahead and share. Everyone see a PowerPoint? Okay, so as you can see, what we'll be talking about today is child and family well-being, as Taylor said, and really focusing in on how to best understand adverse childhood experiences, the study that kicked that off and what we're thinking about since then, as well as trauma, its impact, prevalence, and resilience. And I feel like we should never be talking about trauma without talking about resilience, and we'll try to sort of hone into the context of child welfare. So again, these are the things that we'll be covering, and we'll be finishing off with some discussion of the role of relationships and the importance of relationships for human development in this process, as well as human healing. Couple of disclaimers. One is I recognize we have a broad range of students, which we're thrilled about. That's what we really always hope for in our work at the UCLA Pritzker Center. However, some of this material may be redundant for some of you, but we have to really come at it from a level of potentially not having learned some of these things in the past or some of this being new material. So I will just apologize in advance if this is redundant for any of you, and I hope that it's at a level that everyone can really find some interaction with. I also want to say that we will be talking about trauma, that some of the language, some of the images and videos, etc., may be triggering. And so I want to make sure that everyone in this talk feels comfortable doing whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. And that includes me. If you need to get up, if you need to turn your volume down, if you need to get a drink, walk away, etc., please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Having said that, I don't have anything, given that we're not in person, I don't have anything that I think would be incredibly unsettling, but everything is so individual, I want to make sure that I state that. So first, let's start by talking about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And can I just get, you can just actually hold your hand up like old school OG style, put your hand up. And how many of you have heard of this study in the course of your school, life experience, professional? Okay, so some of you have, but it looks like it's new to a number of people as well. Okay, so let me, I'm gonna show a video that gives a backdrop of ACEs, and then we'll start to talk about how we also can extend what we've learned from that study. All right, just Brittany, just give me a thumbs up if we're good on volume.
In the mid-90s, Doctors Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda published groundbreaking research assessing the links between childhood adversity and adult health and well-being. In the original Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, known as the ACE study, 17,000 mostly white, mostly middle-class adults were asked about 10 different types of childhood adversity. When you were a child, were you physically or psychologically abused by parents? Did you live with someone who abused drugs? Were you neglected? Was there domestic violence? Did anyone go to prison? Was someone in your home mentally ill? Respondents were assigned one ACE for each of the 10 types of adversity experienced. Surprisingly, more than 1 in 5 of this mostly middle-class population reported 3 or more ACEs. But even more eye-opening was the correlation between childhood adversity and adult mental and physical health.
The higher the ACE score, the more likely people were to suffer from things like heart disease, liver disease, lung disease, depression, suicide, IV drug abuse, and alcoholism. what it said was, we've got a common causality for all of our major health and social problems. And it was all related to what had happened to them as children.
But researchers like Dr. Roy Wade could see the ACE study didn't take into account economic distress, let alone hunger, housing insecurity, and other hardships in low-income neighborhoods.
When I came to Philadelphia and I saw the huge amount of blight, the community violence, the episodes of racism and discrimination, those are stressors too.
When Philadelphia researchers expanded the ACE survey to add questions about racism, neighborhood safety, and violence outside the home, they discovered that while 14% of the general population reported 4 or more ACEs, in Philadelphia, that number was a startling 37%.
Poverty is an adverse childhood experience that gets under the skin. Living in economic distress can actually translate into long-term negative health outcomes, even for the most resilient individuals.
So let me just ask the group after watching that, what is Dr. Wade's framework asking us to consider beyond what was in the ACEs study? If you guys can maybe add some of your thoughts to the chat. I can't see my chat. So what was Dr. Wade really asking beyond what the original study shared? I can't see my chat. Oh, here it is. Okay. Oh, excellent. Excellent. So I'm seeing racism, poverty, discrimination, class, issues also related to the population that was initially studied. Social determinants of health is on here, environmental factors. So exactly what we're going to get into. Thank you all. I appreciate that. So as Dr. Wade is really, okay, my slides are now not forwarding. Is it because of my chat? There we go. So exactly as everyone was saying, there are issues that wrap around and really feed the need for child welfare, as we talked about on Tuesday, and really tend to increase exposure to adversity and sometimes trauma. So these are things like poverty, systemic racism, substance abuse and addiction, unmet mental health and health needs. And so the question really is, how do resources and equitable opportunities impact each of these pieces in an ecological model? Where does the child's school rank? What is community safety like? Is there equal protection under the law for these children in this particular community? What are the resources that are available, the protective factors? How is access to health and mental health care? And so as someone mentioned social determinants of health, as we'll talk about, I want to first share, this is really based off of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. The idea is you have a young person or a child who lives within the structure of a family that can be defined in a multitude of ways, and then looping around that are things like the school systems, community level variables, healthcare, mental health, law, and child welfare. And my guess is that if you look at this transdisciplinary model, this actually probably encompasses a number of fields that you all are studying or thinking of going into. And so it's really important to think about, how do we all approach this together? Because we can't make progress in silos, and kids don't live in silos. Someone mentioned social determinants of health. Really, this is also social determinants of mental health, social determinants of well-being. You can fill in the blank there. So social determinants of health are really the conditions in which we all are born. in which we grow, where we live, work, and how we age over time. So if you take a minute, each of us, to think about looking at some of these social determinants of health, how have these impacted who we are today? The fact that we're all at UCLA today, even. So Dr. Wade and many of us in the field have been talking a great deal about some of the broader context beyond the original ACEs study. And I want to push a little bit because there are other things that aren't asked about in the ACEs study. So these are things like, what's going well for this child, right? What are positive childhood experiences? Because you can have both risk and protective factors. It's so important that anytime we're asking about adversity, we're also asking about the strengths of the individual, of the family, an extended family, of other important adults, in the environment, and in the community. So you'll hear me say over and over again, we shouldn't be talking about ACEs unless we're also talking about positive childhood experiences and strengths, and we shouldn't be talking about trauma unless we're also talking about resilience. Taylor, are we good?
Yeah, so quick question, Audra. Students are wanting to know if being removed from the home and or experiences in foster care are considered an ACE.
Yeah, definitely would be. It was not part of the original study, though in some ways it was, because many of the reasons that children might have been removed would have come up in the ACEs in terms of experiencing abuse or neglect, having a substance using parent, or one struggling with mental illness, etc. So they do coincide. And we'll talk a little bit in a few moments about some of the unique adversities and traumas that get layered on for children when they enter the child welfare system. I just want to also point out that across different fields, social determinants are something that people are thinking a great deal about related to solutions. So even, the World Health Organization has said, look, if we're serious about closing the gap in terms of health disparities, we've got to move upstream and think about health equity. What actions can we take around social determinants of health so that we end up with more of a level playing field? And the same is the case related to mental health and many other fields. Before we talk about trauma, I want to just give some basics around, what is stress? So stress is a state of mental or emotional strain or tension, but it can result from adversity or adverse events, or even really positive events that place a certain demand on us. So in the pediatric literature, they often speak about different types of stress. So positive stress might be, let's say, giving a lecture in front of 160 students. It could be trying to impress somebody or meeting somebody that you hope to impress. So you do see the physiological mild elevations in stress hormone that are all really normative. And then we all experience types of real stress and what in this model they would call tolerable stress. So these are serious. It's something traumatic may have happened, ongoing stressors, but they tend to be temporary and they are buffered by supportive relationships. So for children and young people, oftentimes that's the presence of a caregiver or an adult in their lives. And then we have what the pediatric literature refers to as toxic stress. So this is more prolonged activation of the stress response, and oftentimes it's in the absence of that protective relationship. I don't love this model because I have heard people misuse the idea of toxic stress to talk about things like toxic communities or toxic families, and that is not something that I think holds true. I want to just mention, again, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm trying to mention a lot of things, that there is some genetic developmental research looking beyond ACEs and this idea of toxic stress. And one model and idea that I love that's been borne out in the epigenetic literature is by Dr. Boyce and colleagues. And so essentially, he really has found a biomarker, a genetic marker, that sort of determines the resilience, the sort of ease of resilience for a child or a young person. And so he has this model around an orchid child versus a dandelion child, where someone who's a dandelion can find it pretty easy to thrive despite a variety of environmental stressors and circumstances. Whereas what he refers to as more the orchid child is incredibly sensitive to their environment, right? And so they may be more sensitive to things like abuse, neglect, poverty, etc. But ultimately what he's saying is that given supportive, nurturing conditions, the environment, orchid children can thrive. All children really can thrive. And so then the question becomes, how do we create conditions through which all children, orchid children, what he refers to as dandelion children, can all do well? So I'll pause for a moment before I move into trauma. Okay. So trauma is something that you experience as an individual. It's not an event. So an event can happen, but it's experienced very differently by each individual. So individual trauma is often an event or a series of events or circumstances, again, experienced by an individual that is physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on their functioning in terms of mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So some examples of traumatic experiences are up here. And if you would like to add any to the chat room, we can also make sure that people are aware of those. I do want to call attention to a couple of things. You can see that traumas can occur in an individual level. They can occur within families, at schools, at a community level, through a variety of sort of family development processes. And some are experienced by an entire country, like acts of terrorism, for example, or natural disasters that might impact an entire region. I want to call out the issue of loss. Loss is a common traumatic experience for children and young people of all ages. But I want to call out it's not just loss due to death. So it is common for children and young people to experience the death of a loved one, but there are a lot of other losses included. For example, having family members incarcerated and being separated from them in that way. Having family members deported is also a huge loss and very common in our community. Being separated and being involved in foster care or relative care. So I want to point out that sometimes when we just think about loss, we think about death, and there are so many other experiences so critical to children and to young people. Anything pop up in the chat that we would want to highlight?
Yeah, Audra, someone's just asking about the relationship between community and toxic stress. So to what extent a community can really play a role as a toxic stressor?
Well, I think the best way to think about it is when we're thinking about social determinants of health, the more that we strengthen communities, the more opportunities kids have for those models and role models, and the more safety that they might have. So even if within a home, there may be stressors, or even within a school, there may be stressors. Maybe the community is the safe space. Sometimes school becomes the safe space. But if you're not safe at home, you're not safe at school, and you're not safe in your community, you can imagine that multi-layered progression of complex trauma.
Okay, and then we have another student asking for an example of traumatic grief.
Sure. So traumatic grief is a little bit different than grief alone, in that traumatic grief often involves a traumatic loss. So for example, if your sister if you're a child and your sibling dies, that's huge. I mean, that's so much grief and loss to manage. But if your sister, I don't want to give too many examples because again, they're graphic and thinking about those. But so for example, I've worked with a young person who they were walking down the street and a car came up on the curb and killed her sibling. Or I've worked with another child whose father was shot and he was a witness to that. So that grief is compounded by there being this traumatic event when it happened. That's the most simple way for me to describe it. So you're working then both through trauma and potentially post-traumatic stress disorder or child traumatic stress, and you're also working through grief and loss. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to keep us going. I want to just share, these are images drawn by, this is from one of my elementary school trauma programs, but these are images just to give you a sense for the variety of what kids are experiencing. And what I want to point out is, despite the fact that they could quickly draw what's going on for them, they're showing up to school, they're playing Foursquare at recess, they're engaging with you, even being sometimes humorous or being a troublemaker. So the fact that our kids experience so many traumatic events, what's always the flip side that's surprising is how much resilience they show and how much they're still showing up for. So these are just sort of examples or quotes from some young people. Can I have somebody actually read this one? This was from an LAUSD 6th grader. Okay, Lester? Oh.
Go ahead, Grant.
Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, one night several years ago, I saw men shooting at each other, people running to hide. I was scared and I thought I was going to die. After this happened, I started to have nightmares. I felt scared all of the time. I couldn't concentrate in class like before. I had thoughts that something bad could happen to me. I started to get in a lot of fights at school and with my siblings. Martin, 6th grader.
Thank you, Grant. Appreciate it. So what's interesting in Martine's description, this is an 11-year-old. So you can imagine how scary it was. He was at a party, and his whole family was there. All the neighbors were there, and there were shooting. So he's starting to describe symptoms of post-traumatic stress, things like having nightmares, trouble concentrating, that hypervigilance and feeling scared all the time, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And he's also really describing the interference and functioning that happens. So it's not just about some of the symptoms, but how they interfere with our life, with our family, with our peers, as well as academically. And so that, Martine does a nice job of sort of drawing out the impact of this event for him. This is another example. This is a 3rd grader whose father was killed. Does someone want to read this example? Maybe we should go to Lefter because he raised his hand for the last one. So Lefter, do you want to read this one? This is actually a high school student from New Orleans talking about Hurricane Katrina.
Yep. Okay. While walking, we saw people crying because they had no food and water. We saw bodies in the street. They had an old man dead in a chair. I was so scared I thought I was going to die. We were walking on the bridge and the army men started to shoot in the air. And I just started to cry. I was so scared. It started to rain and everyone started to cry saying, I hope another hurricane don't pass by.
Thank you, Lefter. So what I want to share about this quote is we all hear about natural disasters and some of us may have experienced them. This is another type of traumatic experience that children and young people endure. But as you can see from this example, the hurricane was over. Okay, so everything that she's describing is not about the hurricane. It's about the sequelae that came after that disaster. It was having to evacuate, being separated from people, hearing the shooting from the National Guard, then having to figure out what comes next. And after disasters, there are constant reminders. And if any of you, well, I worked in New Orleans for about 5 years post-hurricanes, and just being there and seeing the same houses, the X's on the houses with the number of bodies that were found in there. 5 years later, still seeing ongoing reminders and destruction and things that were not being recovered. So just important to think about trauma, both in terms of when it's happening initially, and then all of the added traumas that go with it. And this is another local example, again, of community violence and also of policing. So this is just a family out for a walk. This is, again, a 10 or 11-year-old boy. There are the familiar to all of us helicopters overhead, shining the light down, police officers holding a suspect at gunpoint, and the child is sort of separated from the rest of the family and neighbors. So these are just examples of a broad range of types of traumatic events. We have acute events. That is, they happen one time, like what Martine was describing. Okay, so he had that event and a whole host of subsequent symptoms and issues related to functioning. Then we have more chronic types of events of trauma. So this could be ongoing physical abuse, ongoing domestic violence, ongoing sexual abuse, and sometimes a combination of multiple traumatic experiences. We also talk about something called complex trauma. Oftentimes this occurs for children and young people who are exposed to many different traumatic experiences. And one element that's really critical for complex trauma is oftentimes the traumatic event occurs at the hands of somebody that the child loves and or trusts. And so there also is that relational breach that impacts developmentally. And then we have historic and intergenerational trauma. So this is the collective and cumulative trauma that's experienced by a particular group of people across generations who may still be suffering the effects of previous traumas. So these are things like slavery, like the genocide of Native Americans, like segregation, the Holocaust, etc. So these are different types of trauma. So how prevalent is trauma? Well, you'll hear people say more and more children are experiencing traumatic events. And while that is likely true, I think our awareness is also heightened at this point, because there was a period of time not long ago, even 20 years ago, when people thought, well, kids can't have traumatic stress, right? Or kids don't remember those things, or they're not impacted by that. So we know that up to 50% of American children are victims of trauma, are survivors of trauma within their families, at school, in their communities. And again, there are lots of different types of traumatic experiences. We also know that many young people with needs related to child traumatic stress do not seek treatment. And I'm not sure how many of you will be working in the school setting from a variety of disciplines, but in fact, 3/4 of children who do access mental health care are accessing it in schools. So it's a really important access point and a way to decrease disparities among children for mental health access. We also know that sometimes kids who are having more externalizing or behavioral issues related to their traumatic experiences might come to the attention of people in various settings. However, it's often negative attention and they end up in a disciplinary track. We also have kids who may be having more internalizing, more of the depression, withdrawal, anxiety, and oftentimes those kids just go undetected because they're not causing problems. In looking at a national survey, this was done a few years ago now, it's thinking about our entire country, every type of person and community. They still found that by adolescence, about 60% had been exposed to violence. And what we find in some of our more urban or highly populated areas is that this figure can approach 100% when we do surveys. And we did a survey now toward the beginning of my career with almost 30,000 sixth graders. So again, these kids are about 11 years old. And within LAUSD, we found that it was actually an exception if they had not experienced any violence just in the last year. So between the ages of say 10 and 11, 94% of the kids had experienced significant exposure to violence. And at that time, we found a lot of weapon-related violence. I'm gonna skip these for the sake of time. So we know that the emotional impact of trauma can obviously be profound. How many of you have heard of post-traumatic stress disorder? I can't see, many of you are not on video. Okay. Anyone heard of post-traumatic? Okay, terrific. And so if you're from a mental health field, that should be really familiar to you. However, beyond PTSD, a lot of children and young people might be experiencing relational issues, problems with peers, with family members. There might be other emotional and behavioral problems like anxiety and depression. Some impulsive behaviors that may look like the child is being aggressive, which in fact makes sense given what they've been through. There might be some self-medication or substance use. And we can also, it's not surprising that there would be impacts in school, because if some of your symptoms are having difficulty concentrating and having intrusive thoughts about what you've been through, it's going to be really hard to learn the periodic table or do well on your spelling test or whatever it might be. And we also know that because of reminders related to traumatic experiences, kids may be avoiding a lot of places. And sometimes important places like school or home might be those triggers. And so then that leads to more of a gap. It leads to more interference with functioning in those areas. I do want to call, especially for those that are involved in mental health, your attention kind of to this piece. We really have started talking over the last 15 years more about child traumatic stress. And that is, we're not looking at things at a diagnostic level. We're not looking for kids who have PTSD. What we know is that for children and young people, even if they don't have full-blown PTSD, meaning they meet that criterion clinically, that even those who have subclinical levels or some symptoms related to post-traumatic stress, but not the full disorder, those kids still have equal impairment in their functioning with peers, family, and academically. And so I do want to also point you to a website called the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which I've been part of for the last 20 years. And so it's nctsn.org. Brittany, I lied. I think that would be a good thing to put into the chat. And this has a number of resources that are helpful for anyone from different disciplines, various communities, but the whole focus is really on improving child traumatic stress in communities. Let me stop. Any burning questions before I continue? Okay. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about trauma and its impact on the brain. And I'm going to try to do this in a way that's sort of easy for everyone to understand. Some of you may have heard of Bruce Perry's sort of hand model that he uses, that is with a hand, to describe trauma's impact on the brain and really to just better understand the operations of the brain. So I'd like to go through that with you now for a moment. So if you guys can put your hand out, it doesn't have to be your right hand. I don't know, that was like very right-handed move. So if you raise your hand, and if you think about the base of your hand down here, this is really your brain stem. And this is really an instinctual, primitive part of your brain. And in this part of your brain, we're doing things right now like breathing, regulating our blood pressure, and all the things that we're not thinking about because they're so core to just being alive. And then we have the midbrain in here, which contains the limbic system. The amygdala is in here, the hippocampus, which is really important for learning. Amygdala is sort of our threat center that tells us something's threatening. So this kind of crosses into your midbrain. And then at the front of the brain, we have your neocortex, or your prefrontal cortex is a really important part up there. And it sort of wraps around the other pieces. And so the prefrontal cortex continues to develop well into your 20s. So for many of you on this call, you're in good shape and you still have growth. For some of us like me, we're sort of we've done what we could do. So your prefrontal cortex is your rational brain. It's your thinking brain. It's reasonable. You've all heard a lot, I'm sure, about executive functioning. That's where that lives. And it takes a while for that to develop, okay? And so what happens when when someone has experienced trauma is because they are getting signals, and I'll show you a couple slides in a moment. If you're getting signals from your amygdala, in your limbic system, it sort of disables this connection with your thoughtful, relational thinking brain, okay? So Bruce Perry talks about flipping your lid, which essentially means that it's difficult to access that piece. We're now in a survival brain, right? We're not in a learning brain, a thinking brain, a relationship brain, okay? So what I want to point out across development is that typically when we think about young children, have any of you ever seen the video of a young child's brain? They have like a time-lapse video of all of the synapses and neurons developing, and it's phenomenal. Nothing will ever happen in our lives like what happens in brains from 0 to 3. And so with all of that happening, and then typically in a child who's developing in a typical environment, oftentimes they are working so hard on cognition and their social emotional learning, and they're having co-regulation modeled by caregivers. So a lot of their effort is going there, and they are not having to spend a lot of time in that survival mode. And what we know with kids who are experiencing trauma is that oftentimes, because of their environment is chaotic or unsafe or unpredictable, they're spending more time developing those pathways to keep themselves safe in their survival brain and have less time to really focus on a lot of that early development. And I want to really make it clear that kids' brains are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. So there is nothing wrong with this process. In fact, it's what we all need to keep us safe. The problem is the environment, that we shouldn't have kids whose brains have to develop in an environment where they're constantly having to think about their survival. And I think that's really an important element here to recognize. Kids and brains are doing exactly what they were developed to do, what they were set up to do, and what we've evolved to do. Unfortunately, we're put in environments that make it inequitable in terms of how much time they can spend developing in other areas. So in a typically functioning brain, for most of us, if something scary occurs, then our amygdala releases some chemicals, so that's sort of like our fight or flight response, like, whoa, I've got to respond here, something's got to happen. And so we do. And after an event like that, whatever it might be, we create a really potent memory in our brain, a file in our hippocampus about this event. You know, whether it was like you suddenly got struck by a car in a car accident, or you see a snake in the middle of a hike. There are all sorts of things. You see a car coming when you're crossing the road, etc. So this is a really important response. It's adaptive. It keeps us safe. So the changes that are created in the brain as a stress reaction help us in the face of immediate danger. When a child or young person or an adult has experienced complex trauma, for one thing, we oftentimes have trauma reminders, even of things that are not unsafe in the moment, but they make us feel that way. They trigger the exact same physiological response. The amygdala does what it's supposed to do. We have our fight, flight, or freeze response. And at some point, there are some studies showing that the hippocampus is impacted by this, that it stops being able to inhibit reactions to things like this, and it may inhibit our memories as well. So we know that having those same types of responses on a prolonged basis can reduce how we're using and tapping into the prefrontal cortex and cause indiscriminate fear. So this is why it's so important to create safe physical and psychological spaces for all kids, and particularly those who have experienced traumatic events. I'm going to share this video and then we'll have a chance to talk.
The stressors many children face day to day in neglected communities like North Philadelphia can be relentless.
We can really manage a lot of stressors. If we are crossing the street and we see that a truck is coming at us, we can manage that situation, get scared, jump, and move quickly. Unfortunately, many children in our society feel like a truck is coming at them all day long for more days than not. And this really takes a toll.
We know from a new body of research that exposure to chronic stress early in life can lead to actual changes in brain architecture.
A child's development is affected by chronic stress. The impact of the chemicals that are released as a result of stress, that kind of unrelenting drip, drip, drip that affects then the way the brain develops. So language functions, the ability to think clearly, the ability to focus, to organize thoughts, all of that is being laid down in very early childhood. When a child is exposed to toxic stress, then the brain is not connecting the way it should.
Especially toxic for children can be exposure to conflict or violence in the home.
I remember having a little 2-ish, 3-ish year old child who was hitting their baby doll. Well, they didn't make that up. Even if they weren't in the room when the domestic violence occurred, when the physical violence occurred, they still feel those effects very, very deeply.
They are perceiving the world as dangerous all the time and defending against those feelings by becoming aggressive.
They may have the history of what happened. They may have feelings about what happened, fear, sadness, anger. They may have no words for these feelings. And then they have these behaviors. But they really do not connect all of that. They don't know that because this happened, I developed these feelings that make me behave this way.
And for many of us who serve children, we don't make those connections either. A 2005 study reported the number of children expelled from preschool for behavioral problems at 3 times the expulsion rate for K-12 students. In 2012, in Connecticut alone, 2,000 children 6 years and under, overwhelmingly Black and Latino, were suspended from kindergarten and preschool, dramatically increasing their risk of dropping out later and being sent to prison. Instead of labeling them as bad kids, why don't we see them as children facing adversities that other children don't? Why are we re-traumatizing young people who are already traumatized?
Okay, I don't know why, but I'm having trouble accessing chat. When I do, I can't forward my slides. So I'll need some help. But if anyone wants to share in the chat something that you learned from what we just heard in this video, or something you found interesting, or potentially understand differently based on what we just heard.
So, Audra, there's a question about traumatic memories and their storage in the brain, and really how to reverse or create new and positive memories.
Yeah, great. So just as pathways can be overdeveloped from traumatic experiences, especially if they're repetitive, we also can create healing in the brain and new pathways based on healing relationships, based on other positive, nurturing, stable relationships in the environment. And the other thing, especially for children and young people, is that the brain is incredibly resilient and can rebound in so many ways due to, it could be even physical infarcts or traumatic brain injury, but also based on environment and experience.
Thank you. And then some of the students are commenting on the alarming rate of suspension among young children. So we have a couple of comments.
So let's maybe talk. I'm glad that you brought that up. I think it is shocking, and I just want to tell you, in my work and with children and young people who are child welfare involved, it's a huge problem. I would say more than 50% of our children in daycare and preschool are expelled, are kicked out, and they're not even captured in those numbers that we're talking about, because nobody is looking at those rates for childcares and private preschools either. And so I think that it's something very few people know about. And when we think about the preschool to prison pipeline, we almost are talking about a prenatal to prison pipeline. And it's important that we recognize that this is happening early on. This is not a high school issue or an adolescent issue, but that these disparities and disproportionality are happening even in preschool. Other thoughts or things well learned?
There's a sort of a question in response to what you just said, which is, you know, are teachers and those who work in school settings really aware of the impact of trauma on young children? And if so, why do they continue to resort to suspending young children?
Yeah, I think the answer is no, and it's not just for early educators or educators, it's really in a lot of disciplines. I think that we have not done, it's a bit of a new science for kids and adolescents, and we have not done everything we need to do in terms of spreading awareness and really creating trauma and resiliency informed systems and or environments that do understand that. So I don't think that educators are purposefully, I don't know, but I don't think that they're purposefully trying to expel kids. I think it's exactly what you're saying, that they don't understand the context. They don't understand the psychological and behavioral impact of trauma, so that then it can be addressed in a different way. And we're going to actually talk some more about that.
Yeah, and students are also commenting on, you know, labeling children bad kids or kids that are out of control without, you know, considering the environment that they may be living in at home, and then how they may be, you know, acting out that environment when they come to school, understandably.
Exactly. And we'll be talking some more about those. Those are terrific points.
And then there's a couple questions, Audra, about diagnosis and sort of how it is that a traumatic event could be diagnosed as traumatic, and how it's the case that children are actually diagnosed with a PTSD.
Well, first of all, to be diagnosed properly, they would need to come into contact with a mental health provider. And we know that a majority of kids who have experienced trauma are not having that interaction. So they are going unnoticed. The other thing that we would see is oftentimes they are getting these other labels that people described because nobody's considering trauma. Nobody's considering that impact. And and actually, if we don't have trauma-informed mental health providers, they may be getting other diagnoses that, again, are not taking trauma into consideration. So we may see ADHD. We might even see some type of psychotic disorder that one is labeled with. And so oftentimes we're missing those pieces. You might see conduct disorder, again, for those of you in this field, oppositional defiant disorder. Don't those labels sound very similar to what we were just talking about? All of that happens when you do not have a trauma and resiliency lens. So we're going to go through that lens here in a couple of slides.
Great, thank you. I think you guys, if I missed your question or if you want further clarification, you can either message me or put it in the chat and we'll circle back to you. Okay?
Yeah, we definitely will. I know that that's one of it's great to have all of you here. The hard thing is we can't always get to everything, but we will afterwards. So don't feel like it will be ignored, and really interested in your thoughts. For the sake of time, Taylor, I'm going to move us.
Yeah, go for it.
And I think, so first we're just going to do a bit of a fun game before we really get into talking about the lens. The trauma-informed and resiliency-informed lens. So, it may not be surprising to know that trauma impacts us differently at different stages of development. So I've just put categories here for young children, 0 to 5, school-age kids 6 to 12, and adolescents 13 to 25, okay? And so down here are 3 columns that describe different potential traumatic reactions for kids that go 3 age groups, 3 sets of issues here. And so we're going to do a poll in a minute, a little game, just to see if you can guess what goes where. So if you want to pull up the poll, Taylor, I'm going to read through some of these, and you guys can have a guess which age group these go with. Oops, my poll is huge. There we go. So the column furthest to the left says emotional swings, learning problems, specific anxieties and fears, attention seeking, reversion to younger behavior, impulsivity and aggression. So in your poll, you can sort of guess the order that these 3 groups go in. What does the first one? The second one is difficulty imagining and planning, over or underestimating danger, reckless or destructive behaviors, isolation. And the third is around emotional dysregulation, trouble with trust and attachment, sensitivity to environment, confusion about what's dangerous and safe, and fear of being separated from people. So we'll give you guys a minute to have some fun with that. I do want to mention that this is not hard and fast. Obviously, you can have any of these types of issues at in any of these developmental stages, but these tend to be the most common across these developmental levels. Has everyone had a chance? Are we getting close? Looks like people are still voting. And this is completely anonymous, just so you know, with the poll.
We have about 100 out of 124 responses, Audra.
Yeah, perfect. We'll give people a few more minutes. Again, it's just for fun, sort of interesting to see how things can impact us differently at different developmental stages. And again, it's not hard and fast, and the poll is completely anonymous.
Let me know when you're ready.
Okay, looks like we're at 95%. People are still voting. Okay, we can end. All right, so it looks like a majority of you voted for D, which is in fact the correct answer. I have to get out of this. I don't know why, but anytime I go to a different function, I can't forward my slides. Okay, here we go. It just takes time, I guess. So these are the answers. The answer was D. So it's school-age kids who have, again, not hard and fast, but more of the issues that we notice or that come to one's attention based on learning fears and anxiety, some attention seeking, and some of that regression behavior. Also, with some impulsivity and aggression, that's where it might be misinterpreted, as we talked about earlier. For our adolescents, again, they're experiencing things more in this middle column. There may be some behaviors that again come to someone's attention. And if they don't understand the context of their traumatic experience, then again, this is where misdiagnosis, this is where disciplinary action may come in because it's not understood. And for infants, as you can see, some of these things go along with things that are typically developing during that early 0 to 5 stage around trust and attachment, reliance upon others, and modeling. Fear, as sort of separation anxiety, and confusion around what's dangerous and safe. Particularly, again, if this is something that's happening within the context of a trusted relationship, it's very confusing. Someone I love and is supposed to care for me is harming me. It can be very difficult at that stage, and there is no verbal way of encoding or communicating about it. So those are some answers around some of the developmental differences. Someone mentioned this earlier, and I want to play this because it makes us all think about, no matter what our sort of personal world is like, no matter what role we play as we move forward in our training or professionally, when you hear people talk about a trauma and resiliency informed lens, I want to be clear. It doesn't mean that you're going to know everything about anyone. And so the question becomes, how do we proceed and how are we trauma and resiliency informed, even when we don't have all of that information? And I think that's really important. Some of you were bringing that up. Well, why are teachers doing this? What's being missed here? And it's really a question for all of us. So this is an interesting video that we'll chat about afterward. Maybe. Yes. Okay, I'm gonna stop my screen for a minute and see if I can go into more of a gallery mode. Perfect. So that was sort of intense, right? Imagine if every single person in your environment had exactly what they had going on. But what it's illustrative of is that everybody that we're interacting with has something under the surface that we don't know about. And that's the case with preschoolers if you're an early educator. That's the case as a mental health provider working in the field that you're working in. It's the case as a social worker. It's the case as a human interacting with friends, peers, neighbors, with teachers, with professors, with students, with supervisors. So I just want to put it out there because the question is an important one. If we're not going to ever know all of that information, right? But if we did, how would we act differently? And given that we don't, how would we act differently anyway? So feel free to share your thoughts. Someone says we would be way more empathetic. Agreement to that. Others, anyone want to come off mute and share? Would be more patient, communicate clearly, hesitant to kick kids out of class, connect with people differently, invest more services for kids, think twice before judging. Does anyone want to come off mute and share more?
I can.
Can you just who's talking? Is this Jamila?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Jamila.
I really just appreciated that video because I think it's important to just view everyone holistically. And I think understanding the whole person and not just a limited role of a student or teacher or counselor that we see them in. So I just really think understanding and viewing people as their whole self. So we may not know all those roles, but just understanding that they're more than just the role we interact with them in.
Excellent. Well said.
I'd like to share.
Yes, Demonte.
Thanks, Jamila. The one thing that I thought about is how overwhelming it would be to witness and experience this video in real life, right? As we were walking around and we see people with like things on their, posters on their face, or they tell us their stories and their experiences. And I don't know if there are research is out there that talks about transference of trauma, but it would be overwhelming to actually experience and know that everyone around you is dealing with some experience that may be negative or something that they think that they can't get out of. And so I think it's coming from a lens of, let me do the best I can in every moment that I'm in to encourage and uplift people around me, because they may not be getting that from where they are.
Exactly. Really well said. I want to just share, since you brought it up, Demonte, that it's a whole other talk. We would need another day together, but to talk about secondary traumatic stress and the impact of working with people who experience trauma. And in all of the work that we do and that you all have done and will continue to do, it's so important to think about self-care. And it's important to think about what we take on, what we can manage, and how to put our own oxygen masks on. Because you're not going to be the best teacher you can be, or the best psychologist you can be, or the best parent or friend or partner that you can be, if you're not taking care of yourself. On the airplane, they say, oxygen mask come down. What do you do first? You're supposed to put it on yourself. Otherwise, you're flat out and you can't help anybody around you. And it really is the same concept. And especially common now, we're talking a lot about the idea of moral distress. In the fields that some of us are in, we are asked to do things that don't jive with us, that don't fit with us. And this originated actually for those in the military. who are asked to do things that are counter to their ethics. And similarly for a social worker, to have to make a decision around either removing a child or walking away from a child and leaving them in a situation when either of those decisions may feel morally wrong to them. So this is, self-care is so important, and the acknowledgement and understanding of professional well-being as you move through your careers is vital. We don't have a lot of time to focus on it today, but I'm really glad you brought that up. The other thing that I think I heard you saying both in the chat and both with Jamila and DeMonte sharing is that because we really don't know, the question was, if you knew, right, like DeMonte said, we're all walking around, we've got like this sign, right, like this thought bubble up above us that says exactly what we're going through. That's a lot to carry, yes, but also we might interact differently. We're not going to have those signs. So when the question is, how would you respond differently if you knew these things? The answer really is we should be responding differently all the time, just like you're saying. It makes us think about things in a different way. And that's why it's a pretty heavy video, but I think it sort of calls us on the carpet around some of our own responses and behaviors and how busy we get in our busyness and not thinking about the importance of connection. So I appreciate you guys sharing both in the chat and coming off mute in this venue. So I appreciate that to both of you. And then someone is sharing now, Cheyenne, that it's also important to see care providers in their story, environment, and day-to-day life. I missed the end of the comment, but do you want to share more about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm Cian, so I just wanted to comment on because we're talking about kids, children in the system, but also sometimes, you know, the people who are serving the system. I think a lot of people go into the system with such experiences and wanting to make a change, which is coming from a very positive perspective. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that how that triggers our past, what we are dealing with. And just like you said, you know, we have to put ourselves first, unfortunately. And we need to be aware of that. And I think, yeah, should be encouraged to participate, you know, in self-care, but just to be really self-aware. I think that's very important while helping others.
Yeah, well said, thank you. And setting things up so that we have consultative and supervision systems in the work that we do so that we have space to acknowledge that and to get support around how to build ourselves back up so we can go back out there. Excellent. Okay, we're going to continue a little bit on this vein. So now, having learned something about adverse childhood experiences, we talked a bit about social determinants of health, the impacts of trauma, and all that we cannot see when we're working with individuals. So now let's imagine there's a child who has had the types of experience we've heard about and what we've talked about, okay? And now they enter foster care. So let me ask you to share. Give me a second. I don't know why it takes a minute. To share, what is the impact of being placed in the child welfare system? We've talked about different adversities. We've talked about different traumas. And so now, what is the added adversity or trauma of being placed in the child welfare system? You guys want to throw some things out in the chat that I'm not going to open. So Taylor or Brittany, you'll have to help me because it creates a lag.
So separation from family, community, siblings, loved ones. Separation anxiety may increase, child may feel unwanted, detachment, education lost, loneliness, re-traumatizing to be pulled away from a life you've always known, disruption from daily routine. This is an ACE, creation of trust issues. Child may feel like they have no one. Multiple foster placements create issues for children. Loss of supported relationships, isolation, self-blame, feelings of unworthiness, confusion. They might think it's their fault, uncertainty and fear, and re-entry into foster care. The new home may not be any safer. Moving around creates instability, over surveillance, family separation, community separation, justice involvement, anxiety and stress, learned helplessness.
Great. Yeah, you guys are spot on. And I think that you sort of made all of these points for me, so I won't have to go through them. But it is, we already have a traumatized child in most situations, because kids are removed because of some type of abuse or neglect. And also, when there are situations of neglect, it opens children up to other traumas because they're not supervised. They may be exposed to things that are inappropriate for their developmental level. They may be open to other types of abuse from other people, etc. So we already have kids who are experiencing those types of traumas. There may be other things we heard about this morning, right? Maybe they've been in car accidents, natural disasters, they've had medical trauma, they have experienced community violence, etc. And now they're entering a whole new arena where we're removing them. And it may not just be once, it may be multiple times in multiple placements. All of the changes, transitions, and shifts, the loss of control. Someone brought up the change in how they view themselves, potentially blaming themselves in that situation, how that shifts how they view others and the world around them as well. And one thing is the invasiveness of this process for kids. And even, when we've had young people who have shared, like, I wish that I had been removed sooner. Why didn't anybody see me and remove me? There are situations like that. They will still acknowledge all of the invasive pieces of the process, and that not having control over where you'll be next week, in 3 months, or even next year, the court involvement and things that you're told to share and live in a courtroom, and the loss really of your privacy and your family's privacy. So lots of pieces in there that now we're adding into this viewpoint. So in the work that we do, we are trying to not just talk about trauma and resiliency, but also thinking about the whole context of child welfare and thinking about culturally responsive approaches and anti-racist, LGBTQ+ affirming approaches. So I want to see what we can do here in expanding our idea of just a trauma lens. Now, I'm assuming more and more of you are hearing in your various fields about the idea of a trauma lens. Is that the case? Thumbs up, nod, wave. How many of you are hearing about a trauma lens? Okay, and it's probably in different fields at this point. So a trauma lens is basically a shift in perspective from what's wrong with this child to what has this child been through. Okay, that also can apply to families. Not what's wrong with this family, but what has this family been through? And that's an important lens. In my mind, it's an important start. What we don't want, and what you might see in your fields, is sort of a history for a child that has a list of traumatic events. And we want to move beyond that. Sometimes the trauma lens is reviewing a history for a child that's a list of traumatic events. We want to move to a full context, because something may not be listed as a traumatic event when we're talking, for example, about the context of child welfare that just came up. Would all of those things come up in your mind that we just had on the previous screen when we're thinking about a child beyond the initial abuse or neglect? That context is really important. Kids have been torn away from one attachment figure to another, have sometimes received multiple placements. And beyond the attachment, it's the grief and loss, like I talked about before. It's not only the loss of caregivers and extended family and siblings, but it's the loss of coaches and teachers and friends and pets. And it's a loss of neighborhood, and it's a loss of language, and a loss of culture and community. It's so extensive. And it may not be surprising for you to know that kids are not just going to be like, hey, I'm really in my grief today, so you're going to see lots of acting out behaviors. Kids can't communicate that. They don't feel safe enough to be able to say what's going on, and they may not even know that connection that we talked about earlier, which is, you know what? These behaviors make a lot of sense given all the feelings that have been brought up because of this experience I've had. And so the full context is so important to take into account, and recognizing we just see the behaviors, but underneath that is all of this other context of grief and loss and ruptured attachment and previous histories of other traumas and potential neglect. The other thing that's important, recognizing the disproportionality of our system, particularly related to our African American youth, our Native youth, as well as LGBTQ plus kids and young people. And the fact that a majority of kids in care in Los Angeles are children of color. It's really important that we're also considering the impact of discrimination and marginalization. What is the impact of systemic racism, of daily microaggressions related to your race, sexual orientation, or gender identity or expression? What is it like to be an immigrant in our country right now? What messages are we receiving? If you are an immigrant or a child of immigrants, what messages are you receiving about yourself? We have to think of all of these things together if we are really going to bring on this culturally responsive trauma and resiliency informed and child welfare competent lens. And we now have to go out into our various fields with this lens, and we have to approach our work in a different way. We have to approach individuals and families and our systems differently. And I saw that a number of you had heard of a trauma lens. But I wonder now how many of us are talking about a resiliency lens? How many of you are learning about a resiliency lens? Because this is equally important. And I don't know we know all the answers. I don't know what a resiliency lens is. I just know ways that I see it, or things that we can pull both from our research and lived experience into how we start to create conditions through which resiliency can emerge. So I'll give you a couple of examples, maybe from some different fields. So I think a big part of a resiliency lens is how do we elevate everyone's life course trajectory? How are we elevating this? And part of it is we have to stop talking about deficits and damage and difficult kids. And that's what someone was bringing up earlier. When kids get those labels, you're missing the whole picture. If you have a child who is seen as difficult, we actually, in many cases, particularly related to child welfare context, they have been through something that makes their behavior make a lot of sense. So for example, if you have a child in hoarding, and I'll just say working with kids in care, it's pretty common. We see hoarding of food, we see running away, we see lying or stealing, and all these things are big red flags. Well, I don't have time, but I can go through every behavior and tell you exactly how that is in fact an adaptive strength. Because what happens is these things that are seen as deficits are in fact adaptive strengths that our children and young people have made to survive in extremely chaotic or unpredictable, sometimes abusive environments. And those behaviors are strengths. So if you have a child who's hoarding food under the bed, that might be an annoyance for the caregiver, and maybe they get ants. But let me just ask you, and you can throw into the chat, how could we see that as a strength? Maybe it's even a kid who's stealing food from another kid's backpack at school. It's easy to jump on that as a difficult kid, but how could we actually interpret that as a strength? I'm pushing you, but I'm not going to chat, so somebody has to tell me what the responses are.
So it says they're adaptive in an unpredictable environment. They have an ability to listen to their needs and body. They're resourceful. They problem solve. They take matters into their own hands. They could provide for themselves. They have survival skills.
Exactly. Yes, all of those things. And so now when we see a child this way, if we can help the caregiver see the child this way to understand this is not a difficult child. This is a resourceful child. They may have not known when they were going to be able to eat or have their needs met. So they learned to take care of that for themselves. Maybe they were actually having to also provide for a sibling or even for their parents. And so suddenly when we can see a child through that lens, it sort of opens up a whole new world, and our reactions are then different. So oftentimes if you have somebody in care that's not trauma and resiliency informed, that's not child welfare competent, they would say, well, lock the refrigerator so they can't get the food, right? And when that happens for our kids, that actually triggers the whole deprivation cycle that started the need to hoard. It makes it worse. So instead, an approach we would take would be to, first of all, verbalize. It makes a lot of sense why you're hoarding food under your bed, because you didn't know when you were going to get your next meal. And we understand that. And you've just come to live with us, and it's hard for you to trust that we're going to meet that need. And I hope over time you can. So for now, why don't we keep packaged foods under your bed, and once they're open, let's go ahead and bring them in the kitchen. I'm going to put a basket out that's always available to you with your favorite foods anytime you feel like you need them. It's decreasing the deprivation versus increasing it. So you can see from any of the parenting literature, okay, maybe a punishment, maybe limitation, maybe that makes sense in a typical situation. But if you don't understand the scenario, you're making things worse. And worse off, you're not allowing the child then to be able to understand, wait a minute, I have strengths. This makes sense given what I've been through. So that shift is the best way I know how to talk about a resiliency lens. That shift from deficit, damage, and difficult to understanding adaptive strength. Also, if the trauma lens is asking, it's not what is shifting from what's wrong with this child to what has this child been through. I think the resiliency lens is asking, what's right with this child? What is going well? And focusing on the wins. And I'll tell you a couple of stories about that, one in a school and one in foster care. We had a family we worked with years ago. Their kids are now young adults, but they had 2 kids placed with them through foster care, and they were 4 and 5. And they had significant trauma histories, and there was not the opportunity to reunify, and it wasn't something that the birth parents wanted anyway. So with these 2 kids, the social worker didn't have a lot of information, but said they've had significant trauma. I think likely they have intellectual disabilities because they seem really behind, developmentally. So the kids started school a few months later, and the resource parents who had worked with us at Tice got a call from the kindergarten teacher. And the teacher calls and says, we have a huge problem. Sean has written his name all over the wall. And so this amazing parent, with a resiliency lens, was able to put down the phone and call to her husband, Mike, Sean wrote his name all over the wall. And it was like, yes, Sean can write his name, right? So they were so excited by this win. And in the moment, it takes things like that. It may seem small. Of course, they then had to talk about how to shape the writing of the name from the wall to something more appropriate. But to celebrate the win in that moment, like, hey, look what Sean can do. They didn't know he could write his name. Those kids, of course, both ended up in gifted and talented education and are doing really well. But that's the idea. Recently, I actually saw this when I was supporting someone at a school. There was a child who had been hospitalized because she was suicidal, youth. And she was 16. And so the relative caregiver was at the emergency IEP meeting when the child came back to school. And she'd been back to school a couple of days. And the teacher started complaining about, well, she hasn't turned in her homework and she hasn't done her worksheet. And it was so cool because it was actually the assistant principal in the school who had the resiliency lens and could see that this poor, aunt felt so deflated in the moment. And he was able to say, wait a minute. This child is coming to school. She hasn't cut herself in 3 days. She doesn't want to kill herself today. Like, these are wins. Now, it may be hard to come to that, but if we don't, then we're not recognizing the resilience for every individual. Does that make sense? That may not be a win for you or for me, but that's a huge win for her, right? So these are examples of how we can start to do that. And I will say, having worked a lot with school-based mental health, teachers and educators can really be phenomenal at some of these resiliency pieces, and it's small things. As humans, we want to have connection. We want to feel a sense of belonging. We want to know we have a role. If we don't show up, we're going to be missed. And schools are such an ideal place to do that because kids are there for so many hours, right? You all are still, all of us are still learning. We're all still in school. So teachers who can simply say things like, I'm glad you're here today. I heard what you said. I can't wait to see what you do with this assignment. We missed you on Wednesday. Small things like that build resilience because it taps into that sense of connection and belonging. Hopefully that makes sense. I think it's also important as we all continue to think about anti-racist approaches to our work and so much sense. It's not just about, oh, you're feeling really depressed? Well, let's take a few deep breaths and give you some coping strategies. It's acknowledging, of course you're depressed. Look at what's happening. Of course you're struggling with hope right now. Look at what's happening in the world. These are not just, and we're going to keep working toward fixing them. And this is how we can help empower one another to move forward and feel like you are taking action. So social justice is a big part of our work as well. All of us from all of these disciplines. Our goal is to move beyond just trying to stabilize kids and families. It should move beyond just trying to catch kids up to grade level. We should be talking about families flourishing, about children really thriving individually and within a community. So I want to share that lens because I think it's something at the UCLA Pritzker Center that we all share. We can't just talk about one piece without talking about the other. I hope that that makes sense. I want to give you guys some time to talk in smaller groups about some of what we've talked about today, and we have more. But I want you to think about the lens we were just talking about. And how is your field talking about that lens that we just went through? How would a more explicit, anti-racist, LGBTQ+ affirming, asset-based, strength-based approach shift things in the field that you're in? What would that mean to you personally? And how could you further integrate what we know now about trauma and resilience, inequity and well-being into what you're learning in your courses? How do you take that out into the field in your placements and internships and into your research labs? So we're gonna put you into small groups and give you probably about 10 minutes to share in any one of these topics that comes to mind for you.
Thanks, Audra. So Audra, can you end sharing screen?
Will do.
Thank you. And for whatever reason, my option to make breakout rooms is not there at this moment. Hang on one second, okay?
I think you're no longer the host, Taylor. You made Audra the host about 30 minutes ago.
Oh, thank you, Monte. Thank you so much. Okay, Audra, so I'm gonna end your hosting
at
this time. And
I think Audra has to make you host, Taylor.
oh, Audra, could you please make me the host? Thank you for your expertise, dear students and participants. You guys are so awesome and smart. Thank you. Okay, stand by, please. Okay, you're going to your rooms now. Audra, if you'd like, I can write the question again in the chat. How do people are gonna come in?
Hi. Hello. So how many people come into the breakout room? Is it the 5 of us? I think everybody's muted still.
Seems to be just us.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you, Jack, but everybody else through
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was talking this whole time thinking that I was unmuted. I see. My bad. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
So, Audra's question that she posed, first things first, I work for the center, so I believe that I carry this frame in regards to all of the work that I do. So, or at least I try to. And then I was a former foster youth myself. So I think this whole conversation is something that I'm always open to discussing and talking about. But I also know that without even experiencing the child welfare system, we all endure our own traumas. And it's just kind of important to bring this lens, just kind of wear it as an individual and understand that sometimes when people are having a bad day, it's not that they're necessarily upset or angry, but we've all just had adverse experiences. So I try to be mindful about that. But anyway, what about you and your field of work and everybody else that I can't see?
Well, I guess I can go next because I'm unmuted. Yeah, so I just graduated with a degree in psychology, so it's definitely incorporated in my field as well. And I actually took a class that was really enlightening. It was called Learning Problems, School Problems. It was basically about, the whole assessment process and, how a lot of kids get referred to like special ed classes that don't necessarily need to be there. And kind of understanding the whole environment and individual interaction. And instead of like just looking at an individual in a specific moment in time, to kind of look at the whole, like we were talking about earlier, the Bronfenbrenner's ecological, like it's so many things that the kid's going through instead of just like one moment in time. So hopefully the field of psychology, especially school psychology and assessments, within the school, hopefully they're incorporating this larger view of child development. Fingers crossed.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a grad student at the social welfare Luskin, UCLA Luskin. And I completely agree with both of you. And I really like what Ruby said about like wearing that lens all the time. Like I try to think about that. I think even before I came into the field of social work, I always try to think like that. Even when someone reacts like angrily or I don't know, some random person, I don't know, I always try to think like I'm not sure why they're angry. Like you never know what someone is going through. So I always try to think like that. But it is hard sometimes, but it is really important to understand. And as Katrina said, also like not think about that one moment, but like just, I think, I forgot exactly what you said, but I really liked it. And I took it with me. So I think it is really important and significant to like think about resilience and also like remember that like we're all resilient in different ways.
I can go next. I've worked in education, specifically music education, for the past 5 years, I guess 6 years now, and particularly in the independent or private school arena. And I would hope that, more of these conversations could come to light, because I feel a lot of the educators are very open-minded and certainly are viewing these issues as real and present. But a lot of the parents either seem to put a lens of, I don't want to say ignorance, but disinterest, mostly at the cost of what it may portray their child as going on to secondary schools or higher education, and that this can become less of a stigma and more of a just a tool of acceptance and understanding. I think that would be so much more beneficial in the long run. So I love these conversations to be able to build tolerance and understanding.
Hi, I can go next. I'm currently an undergrad. I'm a second year psych major. So it's, for me, I work a lot with like younger children. And so I'm mostly focused on like going into developmental psych. So I think with the work that I've done, it's also interesting to see how a lot of I worked in a lot of schools back at home, so a lot of the times like the way that students didn't or weren't able to complete their schoolwork at home, and like they were only able to get tutoring after school. And also when I mentored a couple of students, they were all super open about sharing their experiences, something that teachers didn't acknowledge, that their parents weren't acknowledging. And as children, they're very vocal about things that sometimes you don't know how to respond to it. And so it's also important to like have that lens of like where their parents seeing it, like what view is their teacher seeing it. And so I think I really like also engaging in these conversations, because it's really interesting trying to find that bridge between I've worked with a lot of foster youth, so finding the bridge between social work and psychology and seeing what exactly where I want to fit with that, and just seeing like the resiliency of different children, of adolescents, and just working in the field is really like opened my eyes to a lot of things that even I wasn't aware of. So yeah, the topic today was really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And Jack, to kind of comment on something that you talked about with working with the parents, I think a lot of times like it's hard for parents to really like face the truth sometimes of what's going on with their kids, because they feel like it's somehow, you know, indicative of their parental style. And maybe it is, but sometimes like they're afraid to address the issues of the kids because they feel like it's like gonna make them look bad parents. So sometimes it's tough, I think.
I also think too, it's kind of generational, you know. I think we live in a new era where talking about what affects you is new. I think a lot of the times parents don't know. Like I try to give, I try to give grace to parents, because I know that there's no specific book to read that could tell you how to raise a child. But this new trauma lens, even just trauma in general, has been coined to be like this new framework of looking at our adverse lived experiences as children and how that affects us in the long term as adults. And I'm thinking like, wow, I wonder if my parents ever had the experience or, you know, had a conversation about what I'm discussing now. And I think truth of the matter is, no, nobody has. It's kind of new. So we have to give a little bit of grace, but also realize that, you know, we have to also teach, and the parents have to be open to learning that children have unique experiences, and we have to acknowledge that every day can be a challenge. Some days are going to be better than others, and how can we best help them so they can be stronger? Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and those are tough conversations to have with parents.
Yeah.
Who want to pretend like they know it all. I mean, not that they're wrong, just, you know, you always want as a parent to have the answers to be able to provide for your child, and finding out that that might not be the case, or as Katrina, I'm sorry, we're kind of cutting in and out on my end, so I'm not sure if I caught all of yours, but what I understood you saying is just having that defense mechanism might be a really vulnerable place for a lot of parents.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They take a lot of personal affront, instead of like, you know, saying, how can I help? They kind of look at themselves as the issue. And, you know, it's difficult for anybody to turn that magnifying lens on themselves sometimes. I'm sure. I know I have a hard time with it sometimes. So, yeah.
Just talking about this makes me feel so good. This course, everyone that's here on the call, I don't know why, I feel like these conversations aren't had enough, and specifically at UCLA, but this is good. I don't know if anybody else wanted to.
Definitely. Oh, I was agreeing. Definitely. I also think like when you mentioned it being generational, I also feel like it's cultural at times, and like it is really hard to unlearn. And that's like a lot of what has been happening, I think, in 2020, like you said, kind of just recently. So I'm glad like these conversations are coming up as well. And
Okay, Audra, you should be the co-host, so you should be able to share what you need to share. And many thanks to the students for your instructions.
And that was great. Hopefully it was nice to talk in small groups. I was able to join one of the rooms, and I know I really benefited from hearing from people from different perspectives and from different disciplines. So hopefully you all are getting to know each other a little bit in this process too. We just have a few minutes left, so I want to wrap up by talking about the importance of relationships. And I'm going to probably go pretty quickly through some of these just to keep us all on time. But relationships are important to talk about when we think about the well-being of children and families. And it's also a foundation of all of our learning and our development over time. When you are a small child, interactions with a loving, nurturing adult are essential to development. And when needs are being met, children can develop positive frameworks that extend into our later relationships. And so this can occur as caregivers are what we call attuned or very sensitive to the child's cues, create safe and consistent and predictable nurturing responses. And those obviously then influence brain development. What I want to be clear on is that we are all human, and so are adults in children's lives. And over time, as kids develop, there is a synchrony that is created in terms of communication and in terms of relationship between adults and children. And these interactions, while they develop a rhythm, you know, there are lots of missteps, mess up, and it requires repair. So the important thing to acknowledge in the work that we all do and in the lives that we all live is that ruptures in relationships are part of it. We don't always get it right. And what's more significant is how we then can repair that damage or repair that misstep. And that in itself is modeling for a child that you don't have to be perfect, and you're going to make mistakes along the way. And I'm going to make mistakes too. And then I'm going to come and I'm going to apologize. And I'm going to be able to say, whoa, that was not like a proud mom moment there. It really made me think about this, and this is how I'm hoping we can move forward, and I'm sorry, etc. Because kids need to then be able to come back and do that. So this is all part of a normal relationship process. If you think about it in the context of child welfare, some of those are really difficult conversations and difficult things that require understanding and repair. But that is just as important as the times things are going well. In fact, oftentimes when people think of attachment or bonding, they think it's only when things are going well. It's those stellar days where everyone's sort of happy together. And while that's true and those form nice memories, bonding really occurs in getting through difficult periods as well. To be able to get through, whether it's a tantrum or something even more significant, and still be able to be there. Maybe you're sweating or crying, but you made it through and you're still there. And especially for our kids in care, when they have a relationship where they can get through something difficult and they aren't kicked out of the house, or the police aren't called, or all of these things aren't happening, and they're looking at each other like, wow, we just got through something tough. That really is when bonding occurs. And it's important that we think about relationships in that way as well. When children and young people experience trauma, it clearly impacts relationships. Again, the losses that we talked about, the loss of those stable relationships, and also it can result in some of the things you mentioned in the chat earlier, fears of a further abandonment, feeling like it was my fault, and so it's something about me, thinking that the world is not a safe place and making it really hard to trust. But the good news is it's also possible to repair those relationships and to develop new relationships, new neural pathways that are healing. So relationships, while they're impacted by trauma, are also a key component in healing trauma. Attachment and attunement protect against stressors and trauma. And so these protective factors have a huge role, despite the risk factors, in elevating life trajectories of kids and young people. Relationships, as we said before, can even repair brain connections. And even if the primary caregiver for a child does not have these attachment and attunement skills, Other relationships can serve as important protective factors, and we can all probably attest to this in our own lives. It could be mentors, other teachers, it could be friends, a therapist, a child social worker, extended family members, neighbors, religious figures, a whole host of other adults who also can positively impact the cognitive, social, emotional, and the identity development of a young person who is involved in child welfare or foster care. So, important note, supportive relationships are essential in building resiliency for all of us. And I'm going to close with Dr. Angelo sharing with us her thoughts on resilience.
There's an African-American song, 19th century, which is so great. It says, when it looked like the sun wasn't gonna shine anymore, God put a rainbow in the clouds. Imagine. And I've had so many rainbows in my clouds. I had a lot of clouds, but I have had so many rainbows. And one of the things I do when I step up on the stage, when I stand up to translate, when I go to teach my classes, when I go to direct a movie, I bring everyone who has ever been kind to me with me. Black, white, Asian, Spanish speaking, Native American, gay, straight, everybody. I say, come with me. I'm going on the stage. Come with me, I need you now. Long dead, you see? So I don't ever feel I have no help. I've had rainbows in my clouds. And the thing to do, it seems to me, is to prepare yourself so that you can be a rainbow in somebody else's cloud. Somebody who may not look like you, may not call God the same name you call God, if they call God at all. You see? And may not eat the same dishes prepared the way you do, may not dance your dances, or speak your language, but be a blessing to somebody. That's what I think.
So as we end our time together today, my hope is that we can all be reminded of who the rainbows in our lives have been, to carry those rainbows with you now as you finish your studies and your training, and also out into your professional life. And also to determine whose rainbow you're going to be, and how we each help those that we serve recognize their strengths and tap into their rainbows. So thank you for sharing this time today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Langley. Let's all give her a round of applause and thank her for her wonderful class today. Speaking of rainbows, rainbow will be our secret word today for the attendance. So I'm going to put it in the chat. And rainbow is the secret word. And Brittany is putting the Google link in the chat for your attendance today. So again, rainbow is our secret word. And Audra, do you mind? Perfect. Just wanted to wrap up again by thanking everyone for your participation. If we didn't get to your question, we have it in the chat and we will respond to you via email. And we will be back here next Tuesday with Dr. Claudia Wong. Dr. Wong is a board-certified pediatrician and specializes in child abuse and neglect. She is part of the forensic team at UCLA, which actually works to diagnose child abuse and neglect. So you'll be hearing about the medical nature of child abuse and neglect, actually diagnosing it, how it is that we can tell that, you know, a child's arm is broken because it was twisted versus because they fell on their arm. And beyond that, she'll also be talking about
some of the more chronic health issues that children in foster care sometimes face, either as a consequence of ACEs and trauma, or specifically because of substance use, prenatal substance use, and the other health disparities that kids in foster care can endure. So we really look forward to her talk. And for those of you who might be like, oh, I'm not interested in medicine, those are not my topics, please consider joining anyway, because as we've tried to illuminate, all of these issues are interconnected. So the child with the broken arm is the child that goes to see the therapist, is the child that goes to school, is the child that needs a social worker, is the child that needs an attorney, on and on and on. And so there's really that interconnectedness that's so essential when you do this type of work. So please do join us. It will be a insightful discussion, and we look forward to seeing you then. And I think that closes it, unless Dr. Langley or Brittany have anything they'd like to close us with.
No, thank you all.
All right, many thanks to everyone.